Okay, great. Thank you, Tom. Sounds good. Okay. I'm gonna go over my spiel one more time for everybody. Thank you for joining us today and for being here. We appreciate it. My name is Bridget Shanahan. I do media relations at the IEA. So if you need anything before, during, after this news conference, please let me know. I'm happy to work with you to get you what you need. I'm going to put in the chat again, for those of you who maybe arrived after I did it the first time, a link to a web page on our website. It's IEAstateofeducation.org. If you go to this link, you will find all the information from our past polls, as well as the information from this poll, including the top lines and the crosstabs. The slide deck will also be available for you there, and the news release as well. As far as today's news conference goes, if you could please hold your questions until the end, I would appreciate that. You can put them in the chat if you want, and I'm happy to ask them for you. If you would like to ask them yourself, please raise your hand at the conclusion of Al's remarks, and we will make sure we get to them. So I'm going to go ahead and start by sharing my screen here. And starting this, go ahead and introduce IEA President Al Lorenz. Al?
Thank you, Bridget. And before we get into the news conference per se, just take a second. We want to send our thoughts and prayers to the families and the parents in Rushville for the tragic accident that killed two drivers and 3 preschoolers yesterday. So take a moment just to send them your thoughts and prayers, please. Thank you. Hello and welcome to the State of Education in Illinois 2023-2024 report. Next slide. This is our 5th year conducting the State of Education in Illinois poll. And here's what we learned. Illinoisans believe every child deserves a quality public education. They think highly of teachers and paraprofessionals. They understand that school is harder than it used to be in almost every way, including that it's harder on those who work in schools and to be a student with disabilities. And the public believes that spending more money on schools, ensuring solid benefits for school employees, boosting mental health investment, and letting those with the right expertise lead the way would make schools better. Next slide. I would now like to introduce our pollsters. This is the only bipartisan and thorough poll on public education conducted in Illinois each year. We work with Normington Pets and Next Generation Strategies for our polling. I'm going to send it over to Jill Normington from Normington Pets to talk about how the poll was conducted. Jill?
Good morning. What you're about to look at are the results of a survey that was conducted statewide in Illinois among 1,000 adults. So not just registered voters, not just likely voters, anyone who was 18 years or older in Illinois was eligible. We were in the field towards the end of January, the 22nd through the 25th. We usually do this survey around this time. We wait for, about half of the school year to be gone before we talk to people all over Illinois. And so sometimes when you look at these data, you might see as you go through the crosstabs, which are publicly available for anyone who wants to look, you might see data that doesn't look like what you're used to looking, because most polls are done of either registered voters or likely voters. But these data are actually reflective of what Illinois really looks like from a demographic and regional perspective.
Thanks, Jill.
Sure.
Now I'd like to turn it over to Pat Brady from Next Generation Strategies. Pat?
Thanks, Al. Thanks, Jill. Yeah, it's always very exciting to do this poll every year, because it really is the only one in the state that does a survey of what citizen attitudes are towards public education. And as Jill had mentioned, because we want to get this right and we want it to be accurate, it's truly bipartisan, and it really is exactly what people, citizens of the state of Illinois, think of public education. So it's always fun and an honor to work on this, and I look forward to Al's summary. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. Next slide. You can see that when asked what their top priority was, Illinois residents ranked having high quality public schools higher than just about everything, including lowering taxes, reforming healthcare, reforming the state pension systems. Next slide. We continue to see that Illinoisans believe their local public schools do a better job than those statewide or nationwide. Next slide.
You should be on page 6, Al.
Yeah, I kind of lost your presentation for a second, so sorry about that, everyone. You can see that Illinoisans graded public schools in the nation lower than last year. Next slide. The same holds true for their opinions about public schools statewide. Next slide. The highest grades actually went to the schools that were closest to them in their local communities. And the grades increased from last year to this school year. Next slide. When asked how Illinois public schools prepare students with the skills they need to succeed in life, grades increased there as well. So I think I want to draw your attention to the fact that at the bottom of these slides with the bar graphs, I'm a math teacher, just, point out the fact that the grade point average, which is listed at the bottom, is basically the grade from last year's poll to this year's poll. So if you focus on those things, primarily you'll get a better view, I think, of the data that we're talking about. Next slide. When asked if schools are meeting the social and emotional needs of students, opinions generally remain the same. Again, I draw your attention to the previous GPA and the current GPA. Next slide. You can see here that Illinoisans believe schools are doing a slightly better job at attracting and retaining the best and brightest educators. Next slide. We've just seen how deeply Illinoisans value our public schools, but now we're going to look at how much they value the teachers, support staff, and faculty who work at schools and university. Next slide. Check out this word cloud. Underpaid jumps out immediately. These are the answers Illinoisans gave us when we asked them the first word that comes to mind when they think of public school teachers. You can clearly see here that underpaid, overworked, and dedicated and hardworking were the most commonly used. Next slide. Now I want to draw your attention to this slide. On the left side are the overall results from the 22-23 poll in light green, and this year's poll, 23-24, are in the dark green bars on the right, which means the percentage of all people who believe teachers were underpaid increased by 9% from last year to this year. And on the right side of your screen, this specifically measures the responses of parents who have children currently enrolled in public schools. From last year to this year, that number increased by 6%. Nearly 2/3 of Illinoisans, 64% of them, believe teachers are underpaid. Next slide. You can see similar results when we ask people about funding for public schools in Illinois. The percentage of Illinoisans overall who believe funding for schools should increase jumped up by 9 points from last year to this year. And the percentage of public school parents increased 6% to a whopping 73% of parents. Next slide. And when those conducting the polling told them that 80% of, that's right, 80% of Illinois public schools remain underfunded. Those numbers increased this year to 74% for all Illinoisans and to 80% for all parents of public school students. Next slide. Then we asked about paraprofessionals. You can see here the number remains very high, with 71% of the public overall believing they are paid too little, and 76% of parents of public school students believing so. Next slide. When Illinoisans are told teachers don't get Social Security, the numbers who believe teachers should receive their full pension has always been pretty high, and this year that number rose by an additional 6 points. With parents, it remained at 74%. You can see the number of people who believe pensions should be cut are below 15% in every category, and when asked if pensions should be eliminated, numbers fell even further. It's important to remember the teachers' retirement system works very similar to Social Security. Teachers pay into it just like the general public pays into Social Security. And in retirement, teachers get TRS and the public gets Social Security checks. Next slide. This question addresses Tier 2 pensions. Tier 2 describes the system new teachers are hired into. Those who are in Tier 1 were hired before 2011 and can retire at the age of 60 or even 55 years old if they have been working in schools for 35 years. But our Tier 2 members cannot get their full retirement benefits until they are 67 years old. And here's what we found when told Illinois residents that. Overall, 63% believe those in Tier 2 should be able to retire before age 67 and be able to keep their full benefits. The optic that came into my mind when Tier 2 came into play was just visualizing a kindergarten teacher on the floor with kindergarten kids at the age of 67. Let that germinate for a second. So among public school parents, that number increases to 71%. Next slide. Here we ask whether people think that teaching has become easier or harder in the past few years. Both parents and the public at large overwhelmingly agree it's becoming harder. Next slide. The teacher shortage in Illinois is growing, and for those who are aware, they are very worried. Next slide. And before I go on, I just want to make a note. I've been involved in education for over 50 years, and I was in the classroom for 33 years. And when you realize what it means to have a shortage, teachers are called up, support personnel are called up to cover classes that they don't have anyone to cover those classes. And it puts additional stress both on the educators and on the students. So this is something that's, is a problem that needs a solution. We also have an extreme shortage of paraprofessionals and other support staff. Paras are the folks who literally make it possible for every child to go to school, no matter if they have a developmental, behavioral, or physical disability. Some people know paras as teachers' aides. They help with IEPs and other students who need extra assistance. Nearly half of Illinoisans know about these shortages, and nearly 80% of those folks are worried about it. Next slide. For the first time this year, we wanted to know how parents feel about the accessibility of public education. When we asked whether every student in Illinois has a right to education in a public school, 91% of those polled agreed they do. When we specifically asked whether every child with a disability in Illinois has the right to an education at a public school, the number rose to 92% of those polled. These numbers underscore the importance and impact of the shortage of paraprofessionals and other support personnel. Next slide. And now we'll move on to the strong feelings from poll respondents about the challenges facing education and educators today. Next slide. For the first time this year, we asked whether Illinois residents were aware that college students are experiencing more mental health problems than in years past. And the majority of people do know this. Next slide. And whether they were aware of the issues or not, Illinoisans favor at 80% providing more mental health workers and services to help. Next slide. Also, for the first time this year, we asked about whether people knew that teachers and staff at schools were being physically assaulted. You can see that nearly 50% are aware of this fact. When we asked whether it was happening in their own communities, about a quarter of those polled say it's happening close to home. Next slide. When we asked whether Illinoisans would support changes in legislation that could help curb this violence, nearly 90% said they would. Next slide. When asked whose voices were most important in determining how public schools in Illinois are run, teachers ranked highest. Parents were second. Politicians are way down at the bottom with 11%. We see this result year after year. Next slide. When asked whether the institution of slavery and its impact on the United States should be taught in Illinois high schools, residents overwhelmingly agreed it should. Next slide. When asked specifically whether we should be teaching Illinois high school students about racism and its impact on our country, again, people strongly agreed we should. Next slide. We asked whether they would support a state law that bans teaching critical race theory in our schools. Illinoisans oppose the idea. When you break down the data, even those who believe we should ban teaching CRT strongly believe we should teach about slavery and racism and its impact and effects. Next slide. Book bans, Illinoisans overwhelmingly oppose them. What comes to mind to me is Fahrenheit 451, when folks were, tossing books out into a big bonfire and burning them. And when I first saw that and read that book, I just couldn't believe it. And I believe most Illinoisans agree with me. Next slide. Finally, a majority of Illinoisans oppose banning teaching about sexuality in Illinois schools. Now, I'll turn it over to Bridget so that we can start taking any questions.
All right, thank you so much, Al. Taking a look at the chat, I don't see any questions. Let's see. Does anybody have any questions? Trying to see if any hands are raised. I know it was a lot of information, a lot of important information about pensions, about school violence. We have a question from WBBM. Al, could you elaborate on the growing teacher shortage that we have here in Illinois?
Yeah, the teacher shortage has doubled and even quadrupled, based on what you look at. We're having teachers I know a guy that out in St. Charles was actually the local president who had to learn how to drive a bus because they did not have bus drivers available. So it's not only a teacher issue, it's a support staff issue. So again, when it comes to covering classes, if teachers have to give up their lunch and their planned period to cover a class because no one's going to let students sit there, the burnout factor, if you don't have any time to plan your own classes, if you have to cover others, it just becomes a little bit harder on the educator and even harder on the students because they don't have access to the same person. They might have substitutes coming in and out. So it's the impact on continuity and quality that is really stark.
Thanks, Al. The next question is from Peter Medlin of WNIJ. So I'm gonna see. So I was
Can you hear
gonna-
me?
Oh, yeah, we can. Go ahead, Peter.
Okay, perfect. All right, thanks so much. What do you make of the data that shows, and I think this is something that's continued year to year, but that people have lower opinions about public education as a whole, nationwide and statewide, but when it comes to looking at public education in their local community, they see that more favorably than they do, education as a whole, statewide or nationally?
I'm so glad you asked me that question. What I see is that people that are experiencing what teachers are doing in their community and how they're impacting their kids is more solid data than what they're hearing about in other places. So they don't really know what's happening in schools in, say, DC, like they know what's happening in schools in their community in Illinois. So the closer the proximity to the public school, the better the estimation of what's being delivered as services. So what that tells me is what they can actually see, they realize the quality of what their kids are receiving.
Thanks, Al. Does anybody else have a question?
Yes,
Oh.
I'm Anna Savchenko with WBZ. Wanted to ask, is there anything that surprised you about the findings of this year's poll?
Well, it's bringing the public's opinion of public education more in line with what mine is, because the trend is extremely positive. And I don't know what impact the pandemic had, but I do believe that more folks realize how difficult a job it is. And many times we go into schools, kids bring, because as a public education institution, we accept everyone that comes to our doors. They bring a number of issues with them. And in many cases, we have to not only be an educator, we have to provide the services of mental health support, crisis, trauma management, all of these things, by the way, and this is more of a reason why we need nurses and social workers in every school, because, we are trained to be delivering academics, but the reality is there's a whole range of things that we have to do in many cases to prepare children to learn.
Is that a difference that you're seeing in public opinion, comparing this year's poll to last year's?
Yes.
Thank you.
All of those numbers, Anna, are on our website. I'll put the link again in the chat just in case you missed it, but you can look back and compare. We asked a lot of the same questions year over year. Okay, next question is from WBBM News Radio. Al, talking about curbing violence, is the state expanding programming changes?
Yeah, at IEA, what we're doing is working on trailer language to SB 100. And one of the things that we want to highlight is system-wide accountability. We believe, first of all, SB 100, whether you're familiar with it or not, and I'm sure most of you probably are, was the piece of legislation that was introduced by Senator Lightfoot to deal with the over-identification of Black and brown kids in suspensions and expulsions. Over the course of the time that this bill has been in play, this legislation went into effect, it just becomes obvious that some guidance is needed so that there's continuity of implementation. So what we're working on now is a trailer piece of legislation that will demand kind of a consistent accountability across districts, and also putting supports in place as to what expectations we are expecting of districts and what we can do to support. So we're gathering data now. We don't have all the answers. We know that the experts are in the districts around the state, and we're working with them and the senator to form a trailer bill.
Thanks. Thanks, Al. We've got another question for you about violence. It's from Zareen Syed from the Chicago Tribune. She asked, you talked about paraprofessionals facing violence in their classrooms. What supports can be put in place to prevent those occurrences?
I think a couple of things, actually. I'll go back to the teacher and educator shortage. When kids have a relationship with those that they're dealing with, it kind of curtails the situation. If you come in the classroom, I remember when I was a kid, if I came in and I had a substitute, I knew right away I had a stranger in the room. So there's that piece. So we have to deal with the shortage, but also there has to be, again, system-wide accountability for all of these things. And there have to be policies in place where the kids are accountable for their actions. There should not be someone that can assault anyone without consequences. I'm not saying anything about the prevalence of that, but it shouldn't be a fact at all. And when we tamp down on the specifics in the trailer bill, I think that's going to help, because I believe that districts across the state, certainly when the existence of an over-identification of Black and brown kids in suspensions and expulsions was brought to light, they certainly did not want to be, a place that shows the evidence of that in their district. But we still need accountability for transgressions. So we need to rein all that in, and that's what we're seeking to do with the trailer bill on SB 100.
Okay, thank you, Al. Switching gears a bit here. This one is from Joshua Blount from KWQC, and he's asking, what is currently being done to help teachers get better pay in the next 5 years? And I think you could talk about that at the state level, but also the work that our locals do too on this, Al.
Right. So at the local level, we are bargaining benefits and wages for the common good and for the educator, every year. At the state level, the evidence-based funding model is putting more money into school systems. And so the public is now showing us through these polls, they want more of an investment in public schools. Just the fact that the data of 80% of public schools being underfunded, when you want to deliver a high quality education to kids, as we always do, you do need the funding and support to do that. So I do believe that the public good is kind of in play here. And once that is brought to mind to politicians, we will see, I believe, funding that will follow that.
Thanks, Al. And that's all I'm seeing in the chat. I'll give everybody one last chance. I don't see any hands. I don't see any questions. I want to thank everybody for being here today. Thank you, Al. Thank you, Jill and Pat, for being here as well. And then just a reminder, if folks need anything, please reach out to me. I'll put my cell phone number in the chat. And also I'll add that link one more time, just in case. So it's real easy to grab. For all of the polling data from this year, but also years past. If you want to use any of the slides in your reporting, you are welcome to use those as well. They'll be available on the webpage as well as the news release. And then we're going to put up a recording of this too, just in the event. I know what it's like to have technical problems, something happens. So thank you all for joining us today, and we appreciate you being here.
Thanks, everyone.